Hello, it's July 11th and this is the New Arab Weekly podcast from the New Arab in London. Each week we look at the biggest stories from the week and ask what happened and what does it all mean. Joining us to unpack the last 7 days in the Middle East, we have analysis editor Charlie Hoyle.
Hello.
And head of news Paul McLoughlin.
Hello.
It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the news. On with the show. We're going to kick off this week pretty close to home, and that's with you, Paul.
After 14 years of Conservative government, the UK finally voted for change last week when Labour leader Keir Starmer was catapulted to the international stage as the country's new Prime Minister. The election of the centre-left government stands in contrast to the shift to the right in Europe and possibly the US later this year. Labour now commands a huge majority that could see them secure a second term if the party's promises of reinvestment in the UK's dilapidated infrastructure comes to fruition. But the path to government hasn't been easy for Starmer. There remains many hurdles, fiscal and political, for his government. After Starmer won his election victory on Friday morning, he addressed his supporters.
Tonight, people here and around the country have spoken, and they're ready for change, to end the politics of performance and return to politics as public service. The change begins right here, because this is your democracy, your community, and your future. You have voted. It is now time for us to deliver. Thank you very much.
Paul, briefly, for those who didn't follow on Thursday night, what were the results?
OK, the Labour Party won a massive majority this election, which was kind of expected. They have a majority of 174 now in the Parliament, which is huge, and they managed to take 412 seats in total, which, to contrast, is they only won 262 in the last election.
That's out of about 600 or so, right?
650, yeah. So they've got, good two-thirds, over two-thirds of the seats. Sorry, good two-thirds of the seats.
Yeah. On the night, obviously a good night for Labour, a bad night for most other parties, except maybe the Lib Dems. Independents picked up a fair number of seats. Some of them who stood on essentially a Gaza ticket, or certainly a pro-Palestine ticket. If we look at those people, who were the big winners?
Well, there was 5 independents who won seats in the election, and some of those were big surprises. At the New Arab, we did kind of profile a lot of these figures, and I think even we were taken by surprise by how successful they were. Yeah. So in Blackburn, we had Adnan Hussein, who won there. Leicester South, which was one of the biggest kind of surprises, was Shaukat Adam, who beat John Ashworth, who's obviously a big Labour figure.
He was in the shadow cabinet.
Exactly,
right? Front bench shadow cabinet.
And he was expected to be a minister. Then you had in Dewsbury and Batley, Iqbal Mohammed beat Heather Iqbal. And in Birmingham Perry Barr, which was probably the biggest surprise actually of the evening, was Ayub Khan, who won there. And of course you had Jeremy Corbyn, who needs no introduction really.
Obviously, as we said, Labour did win this election. Did they win the election but lose the Muslim vote in this? Yeah,
I think it's quite safe to say. Obviously, we don't have hard figures on this, but we have indications that Labour did lose a lot of Muslim votes. So there was one BBC kind of article or investigation into this, which shows that around 80% of British Muslims, voted for the Labour Party in the 2019 election, which was, of course, under Jeremy Corbyn. And in this election, they think that dropped by about 20 points. There's also other kind of indicators that from opinion polls done by YouGov. I think it was around 1/3 of British Indian British Pakistani or British Bangladeshis intended to vote for the Green Party, which is quite big considering they didn't get much of a vote overall nationwide. And also 10% said they would vote for Other, which is probably likely independents or the Workers' Party of Britain, which is Galloway's party, or other kind of pro-Gaza independents.
Galloway lost his seat, right?
Yeah, he did. Yeah, that was one of the... maybe he was surprised with some people in Rochdale. He kind of won his seat last time based on a massive mess Labour made of with their candidate. They basically had a candidate running who they didn't back, and Galloway won on this. But his party didn't win any seats, which again I think was a surprise because the 5 independents did win, whereas him with an actual party and kind of machinery and a lot of background and expertise on running elections, he didn't manage to pick up any seats with his party.
The impression I've been getting is that the people of Rochdale, while many of them may support his sort of politics and ideologies, really thought that actually as a constituent MP, he was really quite bad for the constituency and did nothing for them, and essentially just disappeared after winning the election.
It was a very short stint in Parliament for him, and we basically, I think the biggest reason why Galloway lost was that Labour actually had a strong candidate in this election, and obviously there's a lot of people who are influenced by by what's happening in Gaza, but there's also a lot of people who are worried about, in places like Rochdale, worried about schools, hospitals, public services, this type of thing. So, as I said, I think it's kind of the reason why I think the by-election was kind of not a fair representation of how these independent, these parties like Galloway's party would do against Labour on the national level, because he was essentially running against no candidates.
Yeah. The war in Gaza is obviously still the dominant issue for the region. Obviously, it's played a pretty big role in this election in the UK. We've seen these independent candidates win. Labour are now the government. What do we know about their policy in regards to Gaza, and how has it changed?
Okay, so in November, as you probably remember, there was this was probably the crisis moment for the Labour Party in regards to Gaza. So they had there was a vote in Parliament on the ceasefire. Labour didn't want to back this vote, the SNP vote on the ceasefire.
Scottish National Party.
Exactly, yeah. Sorry, Scottish National Party. And there was basically a rebellion within the Labour Party, including, I think, 10 frontbenchers who rebelled against the party line and voted for the ceasefire. So this led to people on the front bench losing their positions. Afzal Khan for winning the Gorton MP. And we saw a bit of a crisis moment then. I think this is the peak of when British Muslims and other people who care deeply about Gaza were put off by Labour. And the subsequent kind of motions Labour went through then was trying to fix this mess. So we saw a bit later indications that they backed the ceasefire, I think in February. And we also saw Labour promising to recognise a Palestinian state. But of course, the when and how and if is still open for open scrutiny.
So they're now back a ceasefire, right?
Yeah, you can say that. Yeah, but of course we've had tens of thousands of people die since November, so a lot of people would say it's a bit late, and that's basically the international consensus, even amongst the West and a lot of Israel's allies.
Arms sales. The UK sells weapons to Israel. Do we know if, has Labour indicated one way or another, if that's going to continue?
I'm not sure yet. I think that will be something which will be a lot clearer as we kind of come to government. I think obviously a lot of jobs are basically, the British arms manufacturing industry is huge, and we're in a time where Labour's deeply concerned about economic growth and these type of things. So I do think there's also a lot of opposition within the party to selling weapons to Israel, and it's very unclear, I think, at the moment which way they'll go, and the same with recognising the Palestinian state and all these other issues. So I think the issue of Palestine and Israel is a big question mark for now.
The ICC, Keir Starmer, Prime Minister Keir Starmer, loves to tell us how much of a lawyer he is. ICC, is he going to agree and abide by rulings of the ICC in regards to particularly, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu?
Again, it's very difficult to say. Obviously, as you know, Starmer was a human rights lawyer, and I think that is I do think that's kind of ingrained in his kind of psyche. Although some of the things he said about Gaza definitely don't kind of conform to that. But There are indications that the UK was against a ICC arrest warrant for Netanyahu, and it looks like they might drop these objections. So it looks this is not radical. This is something which, like most of Germany and other countries who strongly back Germany, strongly back Israel, are kind of in favour of having of the ICC's legal processes. So I think that we're going to have much more of a, I would say a conforming. Basically, the Labour government will conform more with international consensus on these issues, particularly when it comes to humanitarian international law.
Charlie, you had a question.
I did, yes. So obviously, big night for the independents. Well, the election was a success for independent candidates. Corbyn, as kind of the most high-profile independent, was his campaign, did it stand out in any way from other candidates?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a bit about this in this week. I lived kind of in the area, so I kind of saw firsthand the Corbyn campaign, and it was very interesting. It was, I think, first of all, there's a smaller Muslim kind of population in Islington North, so that Gaza was not as prominent on this kind of campaign literature and on his platform. It was as high up there was issues about rental housing, and also about the NHS. So it was very different in terms of, obviously, Palestine was a major issue and for many voters in the area. And you could see that from the activists who supported Corbyn in this campaign. The canvassers were wearing Palestinian keffiyehs. A lot of them who I spoke to, Jewish, non-Jewish, Muslim, were kind of influenced by Gaza. And that's one of the reasons why they were backing Corbyn. So I would say there was definitely the Gaza element to his campaign, but it wasn't the kind of it wasn't as prominent as a lot of the other independents. So it was more of like what Corbyn represents, which is kind of like on an international stage, he's very interested in issues, particularly Palestine, but he's also deeply concerned about domestic issues such as housing, such as
he's a real campaigner, isn't he? He's always the natural born campaigner, isn't he? I think
massively. I mean, it's just quite remarkable that although he's been MP for Islington North since 1983, Labour have also held that seat for since the 1930s, bar for one election when the old Social Democratic Party won. And he's, so he was facing, it was kind of a colossal uphill battle to go and take on the Labour Party. And it was all based on his kind of reputation of being a good MP, what he represents as an individual and what kind of the old Labour kind of ideology was under him. Yeah. So I think he kind of inspired there was lots of activists out campaigning for him. It was much bigger than I saw from any of the other parties, which I think goes to show, like you said, his kind of ability to campaign and also kind of the connection he had with a lot of people in the area and probably beyond.
Yeah. I thought the election night was really fascinating. I mean, a couple of names that stood out. Wes Streeting, who's now the health secretary, he only won his seat by 500 votes, 500 votes, which is incredibly tight.
Was that Leanne Mohammed? Was that Leanne Mohammed? She was running against him.
That was, again, one of the big surprises. I mean,
also Jess Phillips as well, another prominent Labour MP, who only just won her vote. And both these people were against independents who ran on Gaza tickets.
Exactly. And interestingly, Jess Phillips actually backed the ceasefire in November. So, it really goes to show the strength of feelings about the Gaza issue.
The results on the night for her, I think, were very heated. I seem
you saw her press conference.
Yeah.
It was quite contentious.
Yeah, I think and she was quite upset about the whole thing. A new government, 5 years of fun ahead of us. We're going to stick with elections, but further away than the UK. Charlie, go for it.
Following the sudden death of Ibrahim Raisi in a helicopter crash in May, reformist candidate Masoud Pezeshkian won Iran's snap presidential election on the 5th of July, pulling off an unexpected victory against hardliner rival Saeed Jalili in the second round runoff, with promises of economic and social reforms. One Tehran resident expressed happiness at Pezeshkian's election victory. We are very happy that Mr. Pezeshkian won. I expected him to become the president because we really needed a literate president to solve the economic problems of the people. Thank God that Mr. Masoud Pezeshkian won with the same low percentage of people's participation.
A different election. Charlie, who were the candidates in this runoff?
So Hugo, in the first round there were 6 candidates. 3 were essentially dud candidates, but the three candidates that count were Masoud Pezeshkian, who of course won, Mohammed Bagher Halebaf, who is a conservative from the conservative camp, and Saeed Jalili, who is a hardliner conservative, who essentially went through to the second round with Pezeshkian, going on to lose in the end.
Pezeshkian won. What was the turnout for the vote? Because I think it was very low in the first round. And also, where did the votes come from in this?
Yeah, so I think this election was unprecedented for many reasons. Obviously, the sudden death of Ibrahim Raisi meant that snap elections had to be called. This has also been a kind of tumultuous 2 years for Iran. 2022 saw the Women Life Freedom protests after the death of Mahsa Jina Amini. Then, of course, there's been a kind of regional conflagration with Israel. And since sanctions were reintroduced in 2018, the economy has essentially crashed. So on the back of all that, you then have these elections. And the first round turnout for the presidential elections was 40%, which is the lowest turnout since the 1979 revolution.
That is low.
It is very low. I mean, it's the lowest in the Islamic Republic's history. This, obviously, all systems need, the higher the participation, the more legitimacy the system has. So it got to the point where even Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei kind of chastised the Iranian public for not participating. In the end, none of those candidates got a majority of 50% in the first round. So it went to a second round in which 50% turnout was recorded, still very low.
Yeah.
Pezeshkian won with about 55% of the vote. So close. Yeah.
Thinking about it, about 50% that's about the same as the UK election, I think, isn't it?
I think it was 60%.
59, yeah.
59.
Which is still very low for Western
low.
democracy,
It's
isn't
low.
it?
It's low.
Back to Iran, anyway. You said there's problems in Iran. It's been difficult 2 years for them. Some of it of their own making, let's be honest. What would we say are the immediate issues that the new president is going to be facing?
Well, I think it's interesting maybe to look at his campaign, which really didn't focus on foreign policy at all. So his main message to the Iranian public was, I will focus on social and economic reforms. So social, remembering that the Iranian economy is probably one of the most heavily sanctioned in the world. So there's record inflation. The rial is at an all-time low against the dollar. And then on the social side, again, given the Women Life Freedom protests and, the hundreds that were killed by security forces and the schism, I would say. I mean, the key thing about this protest is that the regime has faced probably its most serious crisis of legitimacy in recent years.
And survived.
For
the time being, anyway.
But survived, heavily damaged reputationally. That's why the turnout effectively was so low in the first round, because it's a reflection. Lots of people boycotted, but lots of people also chose to vote for a reformist candidate. So his task is essentially to stabilize the economy and make some kind of progress on the mandatory hijab and do things like reduce kind of internet censorship, which has been a massive issue as well.
Okay. Would we say that this election went to plan for the regime? And then also, perversely, maybe, did this actually help them, given that they've, essentially the conservative side of the Iranian regime has taken so many hits over the past couple of years. They can now get in a reformist who can maybe take the hits for them and actually give the conservative and more hardline elements of the government a bit of respite.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting kind of dynamic to this election, is that it's important to remember that, you know, the supreme leader essentially controls Iran's system. There are different centers of power, but supreme leader is the most important. The Guardian Council, which is a sort of 12-member body handpicked by the supreme leader, they vet all presidential candidates. So I think even the reformist camp were pretty surprised that Pezeshkian was even selected. And in 2021, for example, when Raisi won, he, you know, put his name in the hat to become a candidate. He was rejected. And usually the Guardian Council tends to select for conservative or hardline candidates. So a lot of people,
because that's what the supreme leader wants.
Well, exactly. And I think, you know, a lot of people have been saying that this is, you know, as you mentioned, this is a good way. You know, Khamenei has been in power for a long time. He decides the strategy of Iran's domestic and foreign policy. Within that, there is room, you know, there's room for maneuver. But he knows the system is basically going through a legitimacy crisis with the protests. You know, those protests, I mean, were quite extraordinary in the sense of the defiance against the system, led by Iranian women and Kurdish Iranian women. And, you know, really put the regime's system to the test. Having a reformist in power allows him to at least try and address some of those issues. But he's still limited in what he can do domestically, because in the end, everything will be decided by Khamenei and other centers of power. You know, the parliament is dominated by conservatives, the judiciary is dominated by conservatives. So he has some wiggle room, but yeah, I think essentially what you had in the second round was Said Jalili versus Pezeshkian. Jalili is a hardline conservative, and effectively putting those two together in the second round nudged the public towards Pezeshkian in a way I think was, you know, you could say almost orchestrated.
Interesting.
Yeah.
What's the general feeling amongst the Iranian public? We've also had, you know, you mentioned the Women Life Freedom protests. There's a general discontent with the system, with the regime. How are they feeling after this now? Well,
I think it all depends on your political stripes. I think obviously if you're a conservative voter, you're unhappy with the result. If you're a reformist, you're clearly much happier. But I think the Iranian, you know, public still, of course, the reformist camp maybe sees this as an opportunity to rejuvenate. But I think there's still a lot of disillusionment with Iran's system. And there's also an acknowledgement that there's only so much room for maneuver, even as the president. So, of course, you know, people might hope for, it gives some hope that there'll be domestic changes, but, and economically, most importantly, I think that's really where the public is at its most discontented. But yeah, his room for maneuver is limited. So there is hope, but I think there's realistic hope that, you know, it's tempered by understanding that, you know, Khamenei's been in power since 1989, and you know, people have seen different presidents come and go, and lots of I mean, another important point maybe is that Pezeshkian is only the second reformist candidate or second reformist president in Iran's history. The first being in the early 2000s. This was Mohammad Khatami, elected in 2001. He also tried to, for example, change the mandatory hijab policy and failed, and he had more of a mandate from the public. So I think, you know, you have to temper expectations in terms of, you know, Pezeshkian was a wildcard candidate. Probably didn't expect to get through as a candidate, let alone win the kind of presidency. And he faces, you know, conservative domination in other branches of government. So it'll be very difficult.
I think what's also interesting is that we had, if we look at Rouhani and Zarif in the, not the previous administration, the one before that, it was also kind of like an acceptable face of the regime in the world, and of course we saw the nuclear deal being established then. And Zarif was very good at this kind of like schmoozing amongst it. He was very well educated, very erudite kind of foreign minister.
Yeah.
It perhaps makes you wonder with with Trump possibly coming to power, if this is also on the minds of voters and on the minds of, you know, people in government, that this could actually provide an opportunity for showing a more
Yeah, it definitely
moderate
does.
face.
I think also it's like Zarif was a major part of Pezeshkian's campaign as well. So he went around Iran kind of giving speeches on his behalf. And I think, Pezeshkian still has to select ministers, and a lot of those ministers will probably be from Rouhani's cabinet previously. So he's kind of an extension of Rouhani's kind of presidency. But as he's also I think only the second non-clerical president after Ahmadinejad.
So more of a technocrat than a cleric.
He is a technocrat, and I think another thing is, maybe important to mention is that reformists are not anti-regime. They're still regime loyalists. It's just they're given they focus more on a kind of not pro-West but open to the West policy, and certainly socially they're more liberal. But Pezeshkian, even during his campaign and after he won, has consistently thanked Khamenei for his support and thanked Khamenei for backing him in the first place. So he's still very loyal to the system, so to speak.
They're not new revolutionaries, are they?
No, not at all.
Paul Mayer mentioned the Iran nuclear deal. How's the international community sort of responded to this election? Is everyone getting ready for Iran's state dinners and maybe new talks?
Not exactly. I mean, so a key part of revamping Iran's economy is to seek sanctions relief, which would require engagement with the West, and that's been a part of Pezeshkian's, stated policies as well. I think no one's under the illusion that this will happen, soon. There's a very short window with an eye to US elections. If Trump wins, they would have until January basically to kind of negotiate something with Biden. But I think, given that Trump effectively pulled out of the JCPOA in 2018, since then I think, Iran's enrichment program has increased so dramatically that the terms of that deal wouldn't even really make sense anymore.
Pulling it back from there would be difficult.
Yeah, I think it wouldn't make sense anymore. Iran, is by all accounts technically capable of nuclear weapons, but maybe not politically, desiring of that at this stage. But I think engagement with the West is Pezeshkian's hope of lifting some of these sanctions that are really hurting ordinary Iranians. But I don't think there's a hope for a new deal. I don't think Biden would have any interest, leading up to elections in being seen as negotiating with Iran's new president. So yeah, it's hopeful but doubtful.
We've obviously spoken about the possible kind of engagement with America. How might Iran now engage with the rest of the region, particularly rivals or perceived rivals such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, as mentioned, Pezeshkian's campaign really focused on domestic social and economic reforms. He didn't really allude to foreign policy too much, and part of the reason for that is that Khamenei, the supreme leader, effectively dominates foreign policy. The IRGC and their foreign branch, the Quds Force, is effectively responsible for Iran's foreign policy in Lebanon and Syria and throughout the region. And the president has no sway over that whatsoever. So I think most analysts would say it will be a continuation of Iran's foreign policy as it stands, even though there is this kind of regional blowback from Israel's war in Gaza, and obviously Iran launching kind of an unprecedented attack on Israel in April. But I don't think there'll be any reining in of kind of militia activity. And I think Raisi's policies of looking east, of sort of breaking with non-alignment of the past and kind of making more overtures towards Russia and China will probably continue. But I don't think Pezeshkian will have really any say over that. So I think it's probably business as usual when it comes to foreign policy.
Final story from me. The war in Gaza passed the 9-month mark this week. At least 38,345 people are known to have been killed, and despite occasional diplomatic glimpses of a ceasefire, the carnage continues. This week, Israel ordered civilians to leave Gaza City. A doomed US aid pier was abandoned, and a UN expert accused Israel of conducting a targeted starvation campaign. One Palestinian woman told reporters what she found when she returned home. The Shujaiya district lies in ruins. I swear, we are devastated. This is no joke. Our plight must be felt by others. Someone needs to empathise with the people of Gaza. Gaza cannot defend Jerusalem alone. Where is the Islamic nation?
So we've seen the massive evacuation of Gaza City by Israel and many attacks on the city. What led to this situation, and also where are they going?
So on Wednesday, the Israeli army dropped leaflets across Gaza City that were addressed to, quote-unquote, everyone in Gaza City, telling them to leave the city, saying it was, quote-unquote, again, a dangerous combat zone. It said that they had designated safe routes, again, quote-unquote, to lead to shelters in Deir al-Balah and al-Zuwaydah. Very important to note, as I'm sure you both know, maybe our listeners know as well, that since the beginning of the conflict, safe routes have repeatedly been targeted by the Israeli army, and many people have died in those safe areas and also on going to those safe areas. And to prove a point on that issue, it was reported today that Israeli snipers have been shooting and killing Palestinians as they flee Gaza City. The UN has said that it is deeply concerned about the evacuation order. There's estimated 250,000 people still living in Gaza City. Some have left. Some have said they will not leave and they don't want to leave their homes. Some have said that they want to leave, but they can't. It is reported the Palestinian Red Crescent said that it received calls from some residents who were unable to leave their homes because of the intensity of the bombing. The Israeli army has ordered this evacuation because it claims it wants to go in and eliminate Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad fighters. The UN Human Rights Office said it was appalled by this mass evacuation order. It said, quote, "The UN Human Rights Office is appalled as the Israeli army once more orders residents of Gaza City, many of whom have been forcibly displaced multiple times, to evacuate areas where Israeli military operations are ongoing and where civilians continue to be killed or injured." This is now, since the start of the conflict, this is now the second mass evacuation order for the city. Paul, you asked where they're going to go.
Yeah.
Who knows? Because there is, at this point, nowhere is safe. There is really nowhere to go. And if they do go, that same thing, if they all go to the south, then the same thing could happen to the south. And, Israel could order a mass evacuation and, then they'll go, back to what remains of Gaza City, and they're ping-pong backwards and forwards, and, maybe a few thousand die each time. And that's the situation that's sort of unfolding. One final point that I think is interesting to note with this news is that this week the Biden administration announced that it will resume the shipping of 500-pound bombs to Israel. Listeners may recall a few weeks back they said they were, maybe more than a few weeks, maybe a month or two back, they said that they were going to stop. They had suspended the sale of 500 and 2,000-pound bombs to Israel because they were being used on civilian areas. They've now said they're going to resume the shipping of 500-pound bombs, although they are still going to hold back on 2,000-pound bombs, which, good, I suppose, but, still not ideal.
And Hugo, obviously aid the entry of aid into Gaza has been a huge issue since the beginning of Israel's war. When they basically, sealed off Gaza in terms of fuel, water, food. Since then, famine has been reported in various areas of Gaza. So it's obviously a continuing problem. There have been several kind of very, very weak international initiatives to get aid into Gaza beyond putting pressure on Israel. So what exactly happened with the US pier that was built to kind of facilitate aid into Gaza?
Do you remember how when they announced this pier, people said that it wouldn't work and that it wouldn't be able to deliver enough aid? Well, it doesn't work and it can't deliver enough aid. For a bit of context, it was launched in mid-May. It cost $230 million. Since it was launched, it has been beset by problems, namely high winds and rough seas. Both, I mean, they really should have seen coming, considering it's in the sea. There's also been security issues. On at least one occasion, it's broken apart. Recently, it's been out of action. Throughout this entire thing, it's had a history of working and then not working. It was damaged by high winds and heavy seas on May 25th, or just over a week after it began operating. It was reconnected on June 7th, then removed again on June 14th, and then put back, and then now they've given up. And now they've said it's going to be permanently gotten rid of. Then they made this announcement this week that it's been out of action. They said they would reinstall the pier yesterday, that's Wednesday, the 10th. It's going to be used for several days. And then the idea is that it will be permanently out of action and they will pull the plug on the whole thing. Their plan is there's a floating dock offshore which has got aid on it, and there's a whole load of aid piled up in Cyprus. The idea is they're going to move all that aid to Gaza using the pier. Once that's all gone, pier goes. I think it is worth pointing out that so far I think they've had about 19.4 million pounds, weight pounds, 8.6 million kilograms of food aid have been delivered using the pier. That's great, right? Gaza needs all the aid it can get, but it's not nearly enough at all. Gaza needs far more than that. And this has been one of the constant problems with aid delivery for Gaza, which was sort of encapsulated by the pier, is that aid to Gaza needs to be constant and it needs to be in incredibly high volumes just to sort of get by. And like with all aid delivery to Gaza at the moment, including with this pier, it has been not enough and very stop-start.
What have the UN said about this?
So this week, we had an accusation by the UN Special Rapporteur on Right to Food, McLoughlin. He accused Israel of a, quote, targeted starvation campaign. He said that this has resulted in the deaths of children in Gaza. Quote, he said, 34 Palestinians have died from malnutrition since October 7th, the majority being children. He continued, with the death of these children from starvation, despite medical treatment in central Gaza, there is no doubt that famine has spread from northern Gaza into central and southern Gaza. He also said that inaction on the part of the international community is complicity. The UN has long been warning of a looming famine, especially in the north, although one has not officially been declared. On a technicality, it's worth pointing out that the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, this chap, McLoughlin, he is an expert for the UN, but doesn't inherently speak officially for the UN. He is maybe a contractor of sorts, but he's not technically part of the UN. He doesn't give official UN statements. He is an expert for the UN. To counterpoint what the UN said, he insisted that there was no denying that a famine was underway. On Tuesday, the World Health Organization said that 60 cases of severe acute malnutrition, also known as severe wasting, had been detected last week in Kamal Adwan Pediatric Hospital in the north of Gaza. Like we had with the pier, these problems are obviously compounded by the fact that aid is not getting in. It was reported this week that hundreds of trucks loaded with food and water have been reportedly stranded on the Egyptian side of the border crossing, some for nearly 2 months. There was one truck driver who said, quote, "I swear to God, before this load we came here and stood for more than 50 days, and eventually the load was returned because it had expired."
So the official death toll now, according to Gaza's health ministry, is around 38,000 killed in Israel's war. Two-thirds probably women and children. But there was also a report last week that estimated that number could be much, much higher.
Yeah, this was in the medical journal, British medical journal, The Lancet. They say, or that they, in their report, they said that the number could be as high as 168,000. It's obviously about 150,000 higher than current estimates. They have come up with this number. It's an estimated number, but they've come up with this by taking the number of direct deaths reported. That's the over 38,000 now.
Yeah.
And then applying an estimate of 4 indirect deaths to every 1 death. Now, they've done this by this sort of calculation has come from the Global Burden of Armed Violence report by the Geneva Declaration that came out a few years back. Indirect deaths, I think a direct death is quite obvious. It's bombs, missiles, bullets, mortars, tank shells, sort of conventional military warfare.
No.
Indirect are sort of social, economic, and health conditions deteriorating in affected areas. As a point, to sort of demonstrate this, on Monday it was reported that 436 cancer patients had died since the outbreak of the war due to lack of treatment. So that would be the kind of indirect they're talking about. It's not because of munitions or something like that. It's an indirect cause of the conflict. And this is how they're getting to that sort of, for every 1 direct death, there are 4 further indirect deaths. This has obviously been quite a shocking report. Asil Beydoun, the senior advocacy and campaigns manager at Medical Aid for Palestine, told the New Arab that this was heartbreaking, but not necessarily surprising.
It's also worth pointing out that number of 38,000 doesn't include people trapped under rubble and people buried in back gardens or lost in their bodies lost in other ways. It's only ones which are documented by the hospitals, which is a very hard task in a war zone.
So like Paul said, rubble, also those disappeared, those unaccounted for. But the number they give is staggering.
Oh, yeah.
160,000. I mean, it's staggering.
186,000.
Yeah. It's unbelievable.
I think even if they're out by 20%, it's still staggering. Even if they say they're done for every 1 direct death, there's 4 indirect deaths. Even if that was 3 indirect deaths, the number would still be. I mean, over 38,000 is too many.
Yeah.
But even if we sort of scale down, it's still going to be undeniably horrific.
I think we can also compare this to the Lancet's other report after the invasion of Iraq, which stated that I think it was 630,000 as an estimate had died. Yeah. And I think at the time, a lot of people were kind of shocked by that figure and kind of disputed it. But I think
they were proven right.
Yeah. They kind of like Iraq, all its functioning institutions under the previous government completely broke down. Under that, during the invasion of Iraq, and the militarization of the country meant that it was a lot of kind of security issues. Yeah. A lot of kind of like the fate of people were unknown. So, I think that even though a lot of people probably question this figure and believe it's too high, but I think it's something which will probably in time be proven correct.
There are many, many, many tragedies with the war in Gaza, and I think perhaps one of the sort of biggest and longest lasting tragedies is the number of people who we will simply never know the fate of. And we will never know what happened and how it happened, and perhaps even where they lie. Few other stories from the week. One here. Netanyahu worried about Europe's stopover due to ICC arrest fears. A government plane carrying Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to the US this month will avoid stopping in Europe over fears about a possible arrest warrant for the premier, Israeli media has said. Do we think any European nation will actually arrest Netanyahu if he stops over in France, for example?
I think there's, I think the deep concerns of Israel about arrest are probably most, were highlighted most by the fears that even if he stopped over in Hungary, which of course is a strong ally of his, and Viktor Orban is very much kind of in the mold of Netanyahu, that he would even be concerned about detention stopping over in Hungary. So you can imagine him stopping at Spain or France or any of these countries, of course.
I think, are they legally... The signatories to the ICC, I think they're legally obliged.
They're obliged.
I don't think the arrest warrant's been issued yet. I think it's still.
No.
So once that is issued, they would be legally obliged to do that. But of course, we saw with South Africa with Putin when he. Omar Bashir. Visited South Africa. He wasn't. So whether they will act on that.
No, I think it's still a goodwill system of, well, it's just politics, really. So no one's going to enforce the fact that you don't arrest someone. But yeah, I think the interesting disconnect there too is that, flying to the States, also, well, not signatory to the ICC, but it shows that divide between, those systems of international law.
Yeah.
Now, using, America's always there as a kind of get out in that sense for Israel.
Another one here. Syria's national airline resumes Saudi flights after 12 years. Syria's national airline resumed regular service to Saudi Arabia after 12 years suspension on Wednesday as the first flight arrived in Riyadh. I mean, between this, we had Assad at Riyadh visit to the Arab League. We spoke about it last week, Erdogan, and he's repeated that this week. President Erdogan of Turkey said he'll meet with President Assad. Has the region now forgotten the crimes of Assad? I mean, which I would have thought would be quite difficult considering they're still going on.
Well, I think you could say at the state level, most definitely.
They just not care anymore?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think it's been a slow process, right, for the last kind of 4 or 5 years, culminating maybe last summer with Syria's readmittance into the Arab League.
Yeah.
That seemed to be kind of a watershed in terms of rehabilitation. But I don't know, Paul, what do you think?
I think you've got it's on two levels here. The push towards normalization. One's political. You have kind of regimes who want to undermine Iran in its influence in Syria, which I think is a very silly idea. Like that they could achieve this by normalization. Or they kind of agree with the Assad tactic of dealing with uprisings, which is, to crush them. Or on another level, you have what happened to Jordan is purely economic, and I think this is the case with Turkey. Turkey's economy hasn't been in great shape, and I see that Turkey, its kind of effort for normalization, as this is kind of a gateway to the Syria's a gateway to the region. I think this is kind of the kind of impetus for normalization for Turkey in this regard.
Another one. The UAE sentences 43 to life for terror links in mass trial. A UAE court on Wednesday handed life sentences to 43 Emiratis for, quote, terror-related offences in a mass trial described as a sham by human rights groups and experts, including UN experts and Amnesty International. My question to you, knowing with another example of, let's say, the far less than perfect human rights record of the UAE, we also have the story this week of the Irish air hostess who has been accused of some seemingly fairly jumped up charges. Should people go on holiday to the UAE knowing everything that we know? Charlie, you going to go?
Well, I wasn't planning to anytime soon. I think obviously it's a personal decision, and good to be aware of these developments on a human rights level. There have been a few similar cases in recent years, notably with Matthew Hedges, a PhD student who was alleged of being a spy. I believe that was a long running case. But yeah, this, like, as Amnesty and Human Rights Watch have said, this is these kind of mass trials, obviously. Huge violations of individual rights.
Yeah. Paul, you going to go to the UAE on holiday? Would you recommend somebody to go?
I think there's not. I think one of the things we have to note is, like, there's very probably precious few countries in the region which are kind of like have a crystal clean human rights record. So visiting any of them would be kind of like Charlie said, a question of personal choice and morals.
Yes, I think so. A lot of good stuff on the New Arab's website this week. Paul, you've brought something for us.
Yeah, it's from Charlie's desk, actually, and it's an issue which we all discussed before, which is on Starmer's foreign policy in the MENA region, and the title is "What Starmer's Labour Victory Means for the UK Policy in the Middle East," and that's by Jonathan Fenton Harvey, and it kind of addresses a lot of the issues we discussed before and looks at how the new Labour government might approach the region in terms of foreign policy and trade.
Charlie?
Yes, and this week I'm choosing a piece from the analysis desk, an in-depth piece called "Israel Moves a Step Closer to Officially Annexing the West Bank," and that was written by Jessica Buxbaum. I think this is a really important development in the occupied West Bank that has, like many things that have been overshadowed by the Gaza war. Essentially, this was Israel's civil administration, the governing military body in the West Bank, quietly transferring power to a civilian official under far-right minister Bezalel Smotrich, effectively amounting to a de facto annexation of the West Bank. And since that took place, we've seen kind of huge land grabs in the West Bank, announcements of new settlement activity, retroactively legalizing outposts. I think it's a huge structural development that could have major impacts in the future.
That's a good one, that. I picked out Disappeared, Buried, Detained, The Horrors of Gaza's Missing Children by Alessandra Bajek. Also something we've touched on this week. It's looked at a report by the British aid group Save the Children, who found that up to 21,000 children are estimated to be missing in Gaza, with at least 17,000 thought to be unaccompanied or separated from their parents. It's a good read, although difficult at times. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the New Arab Weekly. This week we were joined by analysis editor Charlie Hoyle and head of news Paul McLoughlin. We'll be back next week and every Friday after that. You can subscribe to the New Arab Weekly on Apple, Spotify and wherever else you get your podcasts and be notified when a new episode drops. You can also rate and review, which helps us spread the word. If you have any questions for us or stories that you would like us to cover, drop us an email, podcast@newarab.com. That's podcast@newarab.com, or find us on social media @TNA Podcasts for all the latest news. Don't forget to follow the New Arab on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram for all the latest news, analysis and opinion from the region.